Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. That means the greeting of Islam, the peace be upon you all. First, I would like to thank Sahan Journal and MPR News for organizing this event. Also, I would like to thank all elected officials, imams, and other parties of the community in advance. My name is Abdullahi Noor, known as Sheikh Abul Fadli, the Imam of the Masjid Ar-Rahma Center in the east side of St. Paul. Recently, these places of worship of Muslims have faced increasing threats and acts of violence, and that is highlighting the need for us to address these issues collectively. These incidents have created a lot of fear and concern in our Muslim community, starting with the bomb of the Masjid Al-Faruq in 2017, to the recent wave of arson and vandalism done to the 6 to 9 mosques. Our community is asking us day in and day out, what can the authorities or government agencies do to address the security concerns of our community? Now, all our lives and mosques are at stake. This is very important question to ask all of us. Can you imagine when parents are worried as they send their children to the mosque because of these incidents? Everybody knows mosques are places of worship and is carried in our hearts. It's not only a physical structure, but a spiritual sanctuary, a center of community, and a symbol of unity and peace. It is where we come together to seek safety, guidance, and connection with our Creator. Therefore, it's our duty to ensure the safety and the security of our holy spaces. Sadly, mosques have become targets of these crimes, vandalism, and even acts of terrorism in Minnesota. Masjid Ar-Sunnah has been a target of this act of hate crime. These acts do not only harm peaceful lives, but they also shake the very foundation of our faith and community. We have to stand strong against these acts or of the violence and take proactive measures to all places of worship to address these issues. It is important that we adopt many approaches. Firstly, we must invest in a high-quality physical security system. Installing surveillance system, access controls, and alarm system can help deter potential threats and provide crucial evidence in case of any incidents. We at Sunnah Islamic Center have taken several steps to enhance mosque security. We have installed cameras systems to monitor to building and ensure the safety of our community members. We work closely with the St. Paul Police Department and call them every time we need their service. However, that is not enough to deter potential attacks against our mosque. We need to enhance the security system of the mosque and hire a full-time security guard, but the mosque cannot afford to pay for these expenses. We are requesting the local, states, and the federal government to give us support in granting funds to ensure the safety of all places of worship. We need action from government agencies, not only solidarity. Our community needs safety, security, and protection. Thank you all for you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Imam Noor. We will be hearing from more mosques throughout this evening, but I want to point directly to some of which Imam Noor shared. Muslim community members throughout the Twin Cities are feeling anxious and afraid, and many mosque leaders are actively thinking about how to keep their congregants safe. And our goal for this evening is to ensure that all of those concerns are heard, those questions are answered, and where we can, really highlight practical tips and specific roadmaps to safety for mosques to turn to in the coming weeks and months.
And now we're going to hear directly from the United States Attorney for the District of Minnesota, Andrew Luger. As U.S. Attorney, Mr. Luger leads an office that is responsible for prosecuting federal crimes in the district, including crimes related to terrorism, firearms, narcotics, child exploitation, just to name a few. The office is also responsible for representing the United States in affirmative and defensive civil cases, as well as assisting communities throughout Minnesota in community building efforts designed to enhance public safety. So please welcome to the stage Andrew Luger. Thank you, sir. Yeah. No problem. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me to this sacred space. I am honored to speak with you, particularly at this difficult time. How's the volume on this? Okay? You can hear me? Imam, you can hear me? Okay. On Saturday morning, October 27th, 2018, an armed assassin entered the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, during what Jews refer to as Shabbat services. The synagogue had no warning that anyone would attack the house of worship or the worshipers. The assassin, an anti-Semitic fanatic, killed 11 worshipers, 11 Jews, just for being Jewish. Among those killed in the attack were people who had survived the Holocaust, the Nazi-led effort to wipe Jews off of the face of the earth. Imagine living through a horrendous mass murder only to be killed decades later by a fanatic professing the same hate-filled ideology. Jews all over America, including me, mourned the killing at Tree of Life. We felt it deep down, and it revived memories of the hatred many of us have faced in our own lives. That assassin is right now, this week, on trial for his hate crimes and murders. At the time that murder was committed, this community stood with the Jewish community during the very difficult moments. And we are also grateful for the partnership among the faiths that are critical during times of need, including this time when many of the Muslim faith are concerned for the safety of worshipers at mosques in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Just as many Jews are also concerned for their safety, knowing that when they walk into a synagogue, they could be the victim of an assassin like the one in Pittsburgh. My family fled persecution in Europe and came to the United States in order to worship and live our cultural identity in peace and safety. They believed that America stood for these ideals and could be counted on to enforce them. I have the same beliefs as my family. I have had my own brushes with hate, even if they are minor compared with an arson or a bombing of a mosque. I tell you all of this so that you understand who I am, and you understand the deep roots of my passion about religious-inspired hate, Islamophobia, and crimes against houses of worship. These are not just words to me, or issues. An arsonist who sets fire to a mosque is not just a defendant in a case to me. This is personal. And it makes me all the more committed to stand with you and to offer you all of the help that I can. I have a team of prosecutors in my office that spring to action when a hate crime is suspected or occurs. They work all night when necessary to make sure that whoever attacks a mosque, a synagogue, or any house of worship is brought to justice. This is at my core, and your safety will always be my priority as U.S. Attorney. Most important, this is a commitment that all of law enforcement in Minnesota has made and is making. As you probably know, that I work closely with the police chiefs of Minneapolis and St. Paul, as well as the FBI, the ATF, the DEA, and the sheriffs, and the BCA. When the arson occurred here and in St. Paul, we all worked closely together in order to bring the perpetrators to justice. Behind the scenes, I want you to know that the moment an attack happens, we are working to solve it and to bring the right charges, including in the case of the man who committed arson here. In that case, in order to indict him on hate crimes charges, which we did, we had to get permission from a team of lawyers in Washington, D.C. We did this seamlessly and sometimes late into the evening to bring arson and hate crime charges against the man who wanted to destroy a house of worship. I'm proud of our law enforcement officers and agents, the people who never stopped working until they found the person responsible. And I hope you are proud of them as well. They are here to protect you and to bring to justice anyone who attacks a house of worship such as this sacred space. I'm also particularly proud of how our communities of faith stand together when any one of us is threatened. You all stood with my rabbis and our leading Jewish organization, the JCRC, and they have stood with you. I have long supported the JCRC's work with mosques and other houses of worship to provide safety, training, and assistance. And I know that Steve Hunnigs, who is the head of JCRC, and his staff are proud to work with you. In Minnesota, as I have said many times, we protect each other and we offer comfort to each other in our time of need. My pledge to you is that my office will stand with you and all communities of faith whenever hate leads to a crime. In the next several weeks, my office, in partnership with community leaders and law enforcement, will be launching a new initiative called United Against Hate, with the goal of providing support, partnership, and resources to shed light on the growing problem of hate and Islamophobia and the harm that flows from it. We will be reaching out to people to partner with us. Every single one of us deserves the right to worship in safety, and your safety in this mosque and every mosque will always be at the forefront of my work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Luger. And just, I think we've got a couple of minutes for a question or two. Sure. I want to start by asking about when you're in your office's response to these types of these cases, vandalism, fire, arsons, would you describe your actions as being more reactive or proactive? And I know in law enforcement, and a lot of it is reactive, but it sounds like you have been working to try to add some proactive elements to your work.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's both. We react to a danger, a threat, or an actual incident by working closely with police and federal law enforcement. And I'll tell a quick story that many of you may have already heard, but Chief O'Hara, who's here and will be speaking later, and I were gathering for a dinner, in part to talk about the first arson that took place in Minneapolis. I had cooked food. We were ready for an evening to discuss the work that we were going to do when the call came in about the second arson here. And the chief just looked at me and saw all the food that I had laid out and said, I gotta go. And immediately came to the mosque and said, if it goes quickly, I'll come back and eat with you. And I looked at him, I said, you're not coming back. So I still have food in the freezer from that night. The chief reached out to me, and we realized we needed a federal prosecutor assigned to the case right away, and we needed federal agents, and we did all of that immediately. The proactive part is working with the community to find out where are we hearing threats. When I was U.S. Attorney the last time, there was just a letter threat to a mosque that came in. And because of the relationships that we had built, it was scribbled, and you never know if you take these things seriously or not, but you have to. And the mosque reached out to the FBI reached out to me, and it was a homeless man who just didn't like, he was an Islamophobic homeless man, but sent in a threat. Those relationships can lead to, and we prosecuted him for the threat against the mosque. He threatened to bomb the mosque. And we can't do that unless people reach out to us, and that's how we can be proactive.
Right. And you mentioned this United Against Hate initiative. Can you just unpack that a little bit? I mean, when you're talking about resources, are we talking about financial resources for mosques or just connections?
Yeah, so Attorney General Merrick Garland, a year or so ago, launched this initiative and has been rolling it out in different parts of the country, and now it's here. When I say resources, so we don't have money to give out. When I say resources, it's expertise, it's training, it's the kind of things that already is going on here through a collaboration of houses of worship, but we can bring in from Washington and elsewhere in the country experts to do the Imam was talking about, we need more. This can be a bridge to that.
Great. Hiba.
As you know, many of the mosques who were recently attacked are, they have a largely East African congregation. I'm wondering how you plan to balance your approach to this investigation into mosque attacks with other investigations, including into food aid fraud, which has also predominantly involved and impacted the East African community in the Twin Cities, as well as your involvement with the Countering Violent Extremism programs nearly a decade ago, which also impacted many of those same communities. How do you plan to balance your approach to those investigations while also engaging the community and building trust?
Well, first of all, by being here and showing up whenever invited. The other thing is when there's an attack on a mosque or even a threat on a mosque, one of the first things we do is invite the imams and the victims of whatever the crime is in to talk to us. And we did that here when we prosecuted the individual who committed the arsons. And so, one, we need to work closely with imams from the mosques and with community victims to make sure they understand what we offer and who we are and how we are protecting people. Second of all, just by doing the job quickly, with intention and right. And so here, through a great team of law enforcement agents and officers, and people literally working all night. I was getting texts and calls 2, 3 in the morning as we were trying to track this guy and making sure we had the right warrants going out and all of the levers of power that we can bring to bear. By doing that and talking about that, I hope we build trust because it's something, as I said in my remarks, that is deeply personal to me, that we protect all communities and in particular right now, this community.
Follow, or I can ask, we've got time for one more quick one.
I can ask one more.
Go for it.
Okay, going into the next few weeks and months, what sort of answers can the Muslim community expect to receive from your office, especially in terms of the United Against Hate initiative?
We'll be rolling out partnership opportunities and ways that we can collaborate. But frankly, this is a perfect example of what United Against Hate is going to be. You all, through this one, we'd like to throw events like this throughout the Twin Cities and elsewhere. When I was U.S. Attorney last time, we held events in St. Cloud and elsewhere around wherever Islamophobia was really prevalent, and we thought it made a difference. We built some relationships. like to step that up. We have someone in my office now assigned to work on United Against Hate, and it's going to include the LGBTQ. It's many communities, but obviously right now, given what's happening and given the fear and the concern in the community, we want to make sure that we're reaching out to the Muslim community first.
Andy Luger, thank you very much for spending some time with us. We appreciate it. Thanks very much. And I want to remind everyone that we will have time for some audience QA coming up here in a little bit. You can text your questions to 651-504-8170. You can also write your questions down on the note cards that we have, and we'll have somebody come by. If you flag down one of our producers, they'll come by and they'll grab it, and so we can address those questions to our panelists a little later. I think we've got another imam we're going to hear from right now. Is Abdullahi Farah in the building? Yes, thank you, Mr. Farah. He is the director of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq Islamic Center. And this mosque has one of the largest congregations in the Twin Cities, and in recent years has experienced many security and safety challenges. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
You can pull the microphone close to you.
Of course.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. My name is Abdullahi Farah. I'm the executive director of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq Islamic Center. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq Islamic Center is the most populated and centralized mosque in Minneapolis. It is the busiest place of worship with over 5,000 members coming for services such as education, prayer, and social activities each week, making AIC a highly vulnerable place. When people come to places of worship, especially mosques, they come to find tranquility, peace of mind, cleanse their hearts and minds from the daily problems, outside. But in the last 2 years, that was not the case. Abu Bakr Mosque was overwhelmed by the rush of carjackings, most at gunpoints, robberies, and drug-related activities. These criminal activities created fear, which resulted in the community being afraid to attend the daily prayers, especially the night prayers. An off-duty police officer cost us over $500 with a 4-hour minimum. Private security companies for a guard to patrol during a peak and after dark hours cost over $5,000 per month. The center cannot afford to pay such amount given that AIC is the largest mosque in the Twin Cities. What about smaller mosques and other Islamic centers? Recently, several mosques were attacked, including 2 mosques in this neighborhood, where Abu Bakr as-Siddiq is just a couple blocks down south, where it deliberately was set on fire. With the current resources, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq Islamic Center has yet to provide the high-grade security measures and structural upgrades that the current situation requires. The center and its staff have no trainings on evacuation, even if a terrorist attack occurs, security measures on what to do in an emergency, how to handle a current or future attack that puts everyone in danger. At this moment, we have a mobile camera in our center, in our parking lot. I want to thank Chief O'Hare, 3rd Precinct Inspector Gomez, and also Council Member Jason Chavez for their facilitation. We've been applying for the federal security grant for the last 2 years. We didn't even get a response or award. So the situation that the mosques are in at the moment requires an action. Thank you.
Thank you.
So at this point, I would like to invite our panelists to the stage, and as you're making your way up, I will introduce all of you. So we have Imam Yusuf Abdullah. He is the Executive Director of the Islamic Association of North America, also known as IANA, which represents 15 mosques in Minnesota. We were also joined by Liliana Zaragoza, the Director of the Racial Justice Law Clinic at the University of Minnesota. Professor Liliana Zaragoza is an Associate Professor of Clinical Law at the Racial Justice Law Clinic. Professor Zaragoza and her team of law students represent Minnesotans of color in a range of race discrimination cases. And prior to joining the U, Professor Zaragoza practiced as a civil rights and racial justice advocate for 10 years. We are also joined by Muhammad Ibrahim with the Council on American Islamic Relations in Minnesota. He is the Deputy Director. CAIR Minnesota fights for racial justice, education justice, economic justice, and offers free legal services for Muslim Americans that face racial and religious discrimination. CAIR Minnesota also builds coalitions that promote justice and mutual understanding. We are also joined by Chief Brian O'Hara with the Minneapolis Police Department. He has worked collaboratively with communities and other public safety divisions, including alternatives to policing strategies to enact enduring change. Chief O'Hara was sworn in as chief of the Minneapolis Police Department in 2022. And last but not least, we have the Deputy Chief of Operations with the St. Paul Police Department, Josh Lego. He has 27 years of experience and has held various roles, including investigations, police training, and administration.
Thank you so much for the intros. And I think what we'll do is we'll just start. The first question will just be just a general response from each one of you about your first response when you've heard about these attacks. I'm just curious just to get your gut reactions when you first heard about these. I'll start with Professor Zaragoza. First of all, just give us your response. What did you think when you heard news about these attacks?
Sure. So I think, so first of all, assalamu alaikum, everybody. And buenas tardes, just in case. So my name, again, Liliana Zaragoza, and for me, I live a few blocks away. Jason Chavez is also my council member, so of course I was concerned for my neighbors and my, fellow community members. But also based on what I do, I appreciated the earlier mention of the Tree of Life synagogue attack, because for me, in terms of racial terror in the United States, yes, this is, potentially an act of Islamophobia, and I say potentially because, at the moment when you first hear about when it happened, that's always your first instinct, but you don't know until, you find out more about, well, who is this person, what was their motivation, but that's the first instinct, right? Is this an act of Islamophobia? And in the United States, it's very much connected to race, right? So here in the Twin Cities, yes, the Muslim community is predominantly Black and people of color, but it is globally the most diverse religion in the world. But so it made me think of, yes, the Tree of Life. It made me think of the Charleston 9 in South Carolina. It made me think of 4 little girls who, died in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. And so there is this legacy that it's very much connected to of racial terror, and that's what it brought up for me. But it also brought up, a sense of what can you do? And I know that that's something that a lot of people here are very much facing. And there's been some conversation about how a lot of what you can do feels reactive, right? And so learning more about what can be proactive, what does true safety look like, how can communities prepare for it, and build safety from within is something that I've been particularly interested in.
And we can just kind of go down the line. Chief O'Hara, you next, just your first reactions. We did get a little insight from Mr. Luger about where you were when you heard about this particular fire, but what did your gut tell you when you heard about these initial reports of fires?
Well, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me tonight. I've been trying, I'm the outsider here. I've only been the police chief in Minneapolis since November 7th. Since I've come to Minneapolis, I've been trying very intentionally to engage and just to be present in spaces and community around the city. And obviously, of course, that includes our masjids. It includes meeting in our houses of worship around the city. So, thankfully, I already had some relationships with some of the imams and many people in our East African and Muslim community. But literally getting the call that there was a fire in the first masjid, which is located inside of a mall, is obviously very concerning, right? And we've had, just since I've been here, we learned afterwards that, we've had other acts of vandalism and graffiti that were related to the same suspect. And even we learned afterwards that there were additional acts that occurred, additional attacks that just were not reported by people because people either thought it was not significant or were unable to connect that this was being done, out of hate. So, obviously it's very scary when you first hear this, and then coming to the scene and seeing the video of how this happened in the first fire is unbelievably disturbing. I mean, we're here, I'm talking about the first masjid, the first fire that we had, obviously we had a fire here also in this masjid. These houses of worship are places where family gather, there's a daycare here, there's children here, it's the entire community comes together. It's not just a place where people come to pray, which in and of itself is incredibly sacred. They are centers of the community. They are places people come to and expect to be safe. And just in the first fire, we watched this video while people were praying. Somebody walked right past them and went in and set a fire and then walked right out. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous. And then to hear that there was another fire here in this masjid, for me, it's terrifying because I personally respond myself to any incident that's significant in the community, and an attack on a house of worship, a hate crime, the police chief should respond himself, and that's what I did, because it is truly an attack on our entire community, and it is terrifying for people.
Right. That
whole week it took us to build this case, to have people working on it around the clock. It was extremely nerve-wracking for me, just because, we needed to get this, no matter what we did. I mean, we were, as the imam mentioned, we put mobile cameras, we put police officers around, made posts just to, help people feel safe. But we can't be everywhere.
Right.
And we don't know, is this crazy person gonna go attack someplace else, right, or change to a different, religion or maybe a business or something. So it was incredibly nerve-wracking all week. We were very close for a long time. Lots and lots of people were very helpful to us, and we're so thankful to people in community that were helpful to us, and lots of different law enforcement agencies, including the St. Paul Police. Dozens of their officers spent time with us staking out a location where we thought this person might be.
Well, Chief, I want to ask you more, too, about the Minneapolis Police's response and working with community, too, and we're going to, and Deputy Chief Legault as well. I want to keep going around and giving everybody a chance to respond personally. Mr. Ibrahim, just first of all, what is your response to, when you first hear about these types of incidents, what do you first think of?
Okay. First of all, I'd like to greet you all with the greetings of Islam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Salam means peace. My name is Muhammad Ibrahim, and I'm the Deputy Director with CAIR Minnesota. And for me, honestly, it's here we go again. When we heard about the fire that was happening here, I thought it was a joke because the fire happened, moments prior. And there was actually a meeting that was happening downstairs to talk about how masjids or mosques across the state of Minnesota should respond to what's, all these, hate incidents that are occurring across the state. And I was coming out of class, and I was going to be late for the meeting. And Jailani, who is the executive director of CAIR Minnesota, texted me and said, "Mosque is on fire." And the mosque was this mosque actually was lit on fire while there were imams and religious leaders congregating downstairs to talk about how they should respond and how to elicit better response from our community partnerships in terms of how we address these issues. Now, with many of the things that we've heard from the wonderful speakers that spoke already today, one thing that isn't highlighted is in terms of specifically our community, in terms of how underfunded we are, just from a holistic perspective, and specifically when it comes to instances of just how to respond to acts of hate. So we've done a security assessment across all 90 mosques, and about 90% of them don't even have adequate camera services, and just ways to just even catch if there was a perpetrator that attempted to, burn down a mosque or have some type of, conduct some type of activity, right? And unfortunately, when we look at the way that the state has been funding, thank you. Organizations that try to create some type of racial equity across the state. The data that was done by the Black Collective Fund that recently came out shows that historically we average about 3% of all funding when it comes to just leveling up maybe the playing field just a little bit. So when it comes to our responses, there's a lot of things that I'll get into a little bit later in terms of what we actually need from a community response. But the conversation of proactiveness, we at CAIR Minnesota have been trying to be proactive about this issue for the last 3 years, but specifically when it comes to these acts of hate. Last year we had a record number of 9 attacks on mosques, ranging from East Grand Forks, where the mosque was actually an old bowling alley building, and there was a woman that drove from across the state with an airsoft gun and some lighter fluid and lit this flammable curtain, and luckily there was a worshiper, and this was happening at the morning prayer, early morning, about 5 a.m. And luckily there was a worshiper that was in the bathroom making wudu, washing up right before prayer, and he caught the curtain that was on fire. And fortunately, they were able to, handle the situation. But like I mentioned, the mosque, the building was actually a previous bowling alley, and the roof had a lot of grease in it. So the mosque would have been engulfed in flames, and just like that.
Wow. Well, and certainly we will talk some more about resources and ways that these community centers are trying to better prepare and repel these types of attacks. Deputy Chief Legault, for you, give me a sense of, again, your initial reactions to hearing about some of these fires, and who's the first person you call when you hear about something like this happening in the city of St. Paul?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. The first response that I had was tremendous concern. I'm a person of faith, and I celebrate with my family. And initially, it struck me because of something the Imam said earlier. People come to houses of worship to cleanse their hearts, to find tranquility and peace, and vandalism and arson is the complete and total opposite. In my role as a police officer, and Chief O'Hara gives us a lot of credit, together we determine what do we do to help. How do we engage effectively to help to solve the problem and ultimately identify the perpetrator responsible. That's our professional goal, but driven much like what Mr. Luger said about a deep sense of faith and personal commitment. That underscores it. My first notifications would be through our chain of command. Chief Henry from St. Paul Police Department sends his greetings. He could not come here tonight. And so we would notify those personnel, but also to reach out to members of the community that are affected that we have identified as leaders and have established relationships with. An attack on a Muslim house of worship, the masjid, is like an attack on any house of worship. And so we rely on those relationships we've dealt with people we've dealt with and relationships established so that we can assure them that we are in a position to help and to outline what it is we're doing in the early moments.
And last but of course not least, the Imam, just for you, obviously, it's very personal, but just your general thoughts on, and tell us why you think it's important that we have this gathering of people in law enforcement and throughout the community here tonight.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Praises all are due to Allah, the Creator, the Sustainer, Provider, and blessings and peace on Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the last messenger of the prophets. And after that, my name is Yusuf Abdullahi, and Director of Islamic Association of North America, which consists of 40 centers across the nation. 15 of them are here in the United States, especially in Minnesota. And an attack on a mosque, for me, especially in this area, reminds me what happened in Christchurch. So I always assume the worst of how many people died, the worst of, and whether they were children or people, disabled people or elders. So for me, it's not something that is kind of like there's a fire or gun violence. If it's a mosque, if it's a worship place, I always assume the worst, and we have seen the worst. And that is how I start when I hear the news. And one of the last attacks, and that was a vandalism in St. Paul, a Sunni Islamic Center. Imam Abdullahi Noor was just talking about it. I was driving my kids to school. And then as I just opened my phone when I dropped them, and I saw the vandalism and the messages of the Imam in our group chats, so I had to run and visit and see the place. I believe that person who was vandalized that masjid was not caught yet. And if I'm updated enough, and I believe I am updated enough in this. So an attack on a mosque is actually one of the worst crimes that people can do. And it's connected. I believe it's connected. I believe it could be sometimes otherwise. But we always have to assume that there is no difference between bombing of Dar al-Faruq, killing Muslims in Canada, or killing Muslims in New Zealand. It does make a difference. It's the same goal. It's the same ending. It's the product of Islamophobia that is rampaging, and unfortunately, people are, still doing that. What I would like to see is, and not this level of reaction. Tonight, I would have liked the governor to be here, the deputy governor to be here, and both chambers of the House to be here. And this is a big deal. This is a big deal. We always come, have a conversation, always show sympathy. I really appreciate the police officers. They're doing what they can. And Chief O'Hare, who I met him many times, he always runs to any place that is attacked. We really appreciate that. But this has to be higher, this has to be bigger, there has to be a collective. And the places, we will talk about this as you said, but the place of attack against the place of worship should be categorized totally and completely in a different category. Not like any other attack, So I hope, this message today reaches too many people and we change this pattern of reaction when it comes to attacking the mosques.
Thank you. Thank you.
Imam Yusuf, you mentioned that it has to be bigger, and Mr. Ibrahim also mentioned, his first reaction was, here we go again. So it sounds like there's a sense that there's a pattern happening when it comes to these incidents. And I'm wondering, why is this happening now in this particular moment of time? Professor Zaragoza, can you kind of talk a little bit about the root causes to these, to the increase in mosque attacks, and how, what's kind of at play from a broader standpoint?
Sure. I think, unsurprisingly, it all ties back to this history of white supremacy in the United States. And I think that we've seen kind of cyclical patterns of Islamophobia, or rather, there's always a baseline, but kind of heightened patterns of Islamophobia, just like heightened patterns of hate in other forms, right? So during the pandemic, we have seen increases in anti-Asian hate, for example, right? And I think that this is part of a history of white retrenchment, right? There's, oftentimes patterns of advances in civil rights, or, in religious freedom, or in any issue of minoritized or oppressed people, and you kind of get a backlash. And we've seen across the country, right, there have been attacks on CRT, on queer communities, on Asian people. There has been kind of another period of hatred, basically, that is unfortunately unchecked in some places, right? And so we can't know, right, why there's this particular moment, why right now, and why so many on one day or within a week. But there is kind of this pattern, and this fits into that.
And Mr. Ibrahim, can you kind of talk a little bit about, what's happening locally in the Twin Cities and how that might relate to what's happening on a national level? Like, what's kind of on CAIR's radar nationally and locally in terms of this pattern?
Yeah, I think quite frankly, since 2016, there's been an uptick in terms of how Islamophobia is manifesting into different types of actions. So before 2016, it was much more, Islamophobia was manifesting in a way of, discrimination, in the way of, watching or alienating, putting Muslims on watch lists and so on and so forth. And then what we've seen in 2016 was really this birth of this overt racial and religious tension amongst, from, the previous from the previous president all the way down to, the way that social media now carries the water in terms of the news. So what we have seen is really this polarized conversation that's happening that's really driving up the sensation of otherness, right? Of blaming, maybe what some might say, personal circumstances on the others, right? So there might have been a strong economic downturn. There might be, unforeseen circumstances that individuals might be, facing. But when they go on social media and they see the TV, the blame is being shifted on minority communities. And specifically here in Minnesota, we are talking about, the East African Muslim community here at large that we have seen, and we've seen it manifest in other ways. And for us at the work at CAIR, unfortunately, there's some collateral damage that happens to Sikhs because people assume that they're Muslim because they wear turbans, and they also face Islamophobic hate even though they're not Muslims themselves. So that's how we have seen it manifest, and particularly here in the state. And I want to mention this incident that actually happened in Moorhead, where there, 2 Ramadans ago during the pandemic, after Taraweeh, there's a period where there's, kind of like a lull, and then there's evening prayers that occur. And during that time, there was a young man that came and tried to enter the mosque. And later on, he ended up drawing, hate, sentiments all across the mosque and so on and so forth. And then later on, he was apprehended. And through the work with the FBI, we later learned that he was a part of a 3-member militia that have been posting online about how they were going to target hate and all these, other, various, intentions to manifest hate. And fortunately, about 14 firearms were discovered. And that night he was wearing a trench coat, and we don't know what he could have had on him, but we could have had a Christ Church moment here in Minnesota, specifically in Moorhead. And thank God that wasn't the case, but that just tells us that, that there's a greater need for us to be proactive in terms of how we respond to hate. But here we are 8 attacks later having this conversation.
We can.
Can I add to that?
Yeah. I think the Imam. I think we'd like to hear from you too, as far as in dealing with for safety and security challenges. What are just some things that do you think are some of the most serious challenges to secure these buildings? I mean, people come at all times during the day and night. Mm-hmm. Sometimes. So just give us a sense of some of the challenges that you see.
Thank you so much, and it's a great question, but just I want to add a little bit to the last point that was Brother Muhammad from CAIR, made by Brother Muhammad from CAIR. So that point is really, if we want to talk about the root causes of this, we have to be very open about it. We cannot just, put the things under the rug. We have to be, very open about it. This sometimes goes to a much deeper than that. Islamophobia is a very lucrative and and platform that many people use, and without any consequences. Sometimes they may even get votes in some places. And it has roots, it has history, and it has policies. And I remember after 9/11, many of our imams were blacklisted for just being Muslims. And we have seen that. Yeah. And this is a byproduct of 2 decades long of hate and propagating, hate towards Muslims. And I wish the Attorney General was here, and the District Attorney General was here. He left. I have many tough questions for him, sure, to be honest. So one of the things is that the CVE program that he introduced was singling out the Muslims as a group of threat, suspicious group. God knows how many things that added, or how many people that affected, to see the Muslims as a suspicious group instead of a productive, inclusive, hardworking part of the fabric of the American community. So this is not just something that we can go over it and say and it has a history. When a president of the United States comes out, I'm talking about the former president, and he says that I think Islam hates us, and he publicly bans the Muslims. That's not just him saying that. Millions of people are in line with him on that policy, on that understanding. So actually, the root causes are many and long, and the solution has to be long and particularly debugging all of those things and making sure that we address all these issues. And quite frankly, I believe there has to be some type. Nowadays we talk about the African American reparation, right, for what happened in the past. And my understanding is Muslims need apology for what happened to them since 9/11. So that is one of the things we need to address. Coming back to your question of resources, you see the resources. What does this mosque has? Nothing for security. This mosque has nothing for security. And it got burned. So our mosques are, security-wise, are underfunded. They're not prepared at all to the slightest threat of a security threat. They're not even ready. Another thing is that I always ask myself is, who is responsible of securing the worship centers and faith centers? Is it the congregants, the imams, the leaders of the faith, or who also taxpayers, or the system, the government, the police, the cities, the states, the United States federal government? Who is responsible of the safety and security of these places? Right. Once we define whose responsibility is this, then we can say, hey, you didn't do your job. Sure. But how can you expect from regular people, imams, directors who are not, and police officers who are not armed, this is not their job, congregants who came for faith, to practice their faith, kids who came to study? Are we expecting them to be responsible of the security of the center? I don't think so.
Thank you. I want to just shift a little bit of the conversation. I want to address a couple questions to our representatives from Minneapolis Police and St. Paul Police. First of all, Deputy Chief Legault, I think we mentioned the act of vandalism at the Masjid Ar-Rahma. It sounds like there's still not a person in custody or been arrested for that, as far as we know.
I did hear you with your recollection. I'm happy to say that we do have a suspect identified.
Great.
Our investigators have established an identity
Thank you.
For that person, and we're working hard with the prosecuting authority to see that charges, to hope certainly the charges are brought based on the evidence that we've created. So I'm happy to report that to you tonight.
Thank you so much.
That's great.
Thank you.
So you have identified, you just need to be able to get him into custody. Is that correct?
Correct. We're working with the charging authorities, and then I imagine a complaint or a warrant would be issued.
Okay.
Thank you.
We'll
so
look
much.
for that soon. Let me ask you, Chief O'Hara, back to you about now the the man who is prosecuted for this particular fire here and the other on the same day was also charged with a hate crime. Just explain for folks the difference between, as a state crime and the federal offense for a hate crime. What are the differences there? And just give a sense for people who'd like to see more people get charged for hate crimes in these types of incidents. What are some of the maybe challenges to bringing those types of charges?
Sure, thank you. Well, let me start off by saying this. It's one thing for us to recognize, and we recognize immediately when crimes occur on our houses of worship or targeting a specific community. We recognize that as an act of hate, an act of bias, and will respond to it accordingly as that. It's different to try and prove specific types of crimes under the law. That's where we get that's where we have to be able to show the motivation. Whatever the legal statute says, we have to present evidence to meet that threshold. Now, thankfully, in some ways thankfully, but the cases that we have had here, obviously the 2 arsons of houses of worship, that's almost automatic. Occupied houses of worship, arsons, combined with the other evidence that we were then able to get. There were very targeted attacks and harassment on our U.S. Congresswoman and other acts of vandalism, spray painting specifically, East African businesses targeting a Somali police officer in Minneapolis and vandalizing his car. Just from all of that evidence, we were able to create a case that could then be federal prosecuted. So it's one thing, having the house of worship in our federalist system in this country. There's some specific things that are required to bring it before the federal government, and we were able to make that case with this particular suspect. And thankfully, because there's just a lot more we're able to do. We're able to put that person away longer, and I just think the services and the justice that's available on the federal side is just more robust than what we would typically get on the state side. So I think that's incredibly important, and just, if you will, also just let me speak to, because I keep hearing it come up from the imam before and from our other faith leaders here, something repeatedly that comes up is the issue of security for our houses of worship. We have been reaching out to all of the masjids, specifically once these arsons started, to try and help and offer assistance in giving some advice on some structural things that can be done. But what we repeatedly hear is that there is not funding available. And even the federal funding that's available does not come the way it should to our state. And we know, we have such a concentration of East Africans, of Muslims, of victims of this Islamophobia. We have a greater need here than what is available just generally across the country. And it's disheartening that our clergy, our faith leaders, our imams have applied and not even heard back. So I'm thankful that Mayor Fry has been working and is working to put together a fund that will be available to sort of take the place of that in some ways for our houses of worship, masjids, but all different faiths, to provide funding, some flexible funding for, security cameras and reinforced doors and that type of thing. So that is in the work, because I've repeatedly heard this frustration that, yes, the federal government has these grant programs, but the deadlines are too short and we don't get the funding, and people here don't even hear back. So hopefully that's something that will fill that void.
Right. Deputy Chief Legault, quickly about, you mentioned we had the incidents in St. Paul with the fire and then the vandalism. Have you gotten a sense of, particularly with the vandalism case where you've identified a suspect, can you say if you believe that person was motivated by anti-Muslim hate?
I can't at this time. Chief O'Hara put a very fine point on it, that we ultimately need to identify the motivations of the person, and truly we can only do that after interview and gathering further evidence. And so I am unaware I know the status of the investigation, but I know that we haven't brought this person in for questioning.
Okay.
And there wasn't what I will say is there wasn't other behaviors at the time that would make it as plainly obvious as the nose on my face that it was bias related.
Sure.
It was a criminal damage and a vandalism on a house of worship. And from the very beginning, we started by believing the first reporting persons that they perceived this was a hate crime. And we don't question that. And Chief O'Hara is 100% correct. It's then our task to gather evidence and information to support that for criminal charging as a hate crime. Those are they're distinct viewpoints, but from our perspective, without a difference. We'll respond and investigate with vigor when incidents like this happen, whether at a masjid, at a church, or at a synagogue, or any place of worship in our community.
Right. And I think Chief O'Hara mentioned just about if you are, or no, I'm sorry, it was Andy Luger earlier tonight talking about just some of these, it sounds like some people who are involved in these arsons and vandalism appear to be exhibiting signs of mental illness. The man who was charged in the St. Paul fire appears to have had some history of mental illness. But it sounds like you still have to take these types of, if somebody is obviously unstable, you still have to take them seriously. So as your officers are investigating these types of crimes, is there a special allowance given for, well, maybe this guy just didn't know what he was doing, or do you have to follow it up as if this person was intentional in expressing hatred towards the Muslim community?
Well, just let me tell everyone in attendance and in answer to your question that we respond and will respond the same way every time, with the intentionality to apprehend the person regardless of their motivation. It would be inappropriate for me to, as an investigator, see some video or take a statement from a person and dismiss what is yet unknown, which is their intention. That's part of the investigative process, and we seek data and information. We work very closely with Minneapolis and enjoy their partnership, and I feel like the feeling is mutual for our support. We will leave no stone unturned to determine what's gone on and to do our very, very best to prove essentially the elements of the crime. And we'll demonstrate our trustworthiness for you as your police department and your Minneapolis Police Department by thoroughly investigating and trying to prove the elements of the criminal case.
Right. Just one more question for both of you before we move the conversation along, but I want to ask about the risk of copycat incidents. That sounds like it's also a concern. So from the law enforcement perspective, what do you think people should know about when one of these incidents happens, and I'll start with you, Deputy Chief Legault, just about, are you telling officers to be on the lookout? So, there might be others who are going to try to emulate this type of violence. What are you looking for?
So that part of your question, what I hear you asking blends nicely with remarks earlier. There's the response piece to the crime in progress, and there's the proactive measures taken ahead of time. In our agency and many agencies around the country, we notify our officers before every shift about expectations, the command intent to patrol areas where we have concerns that are reflected in our data and intelligence directions, but also from concerns from the community about vandalism or crime. And so through those bulletin board messages, our officers are directed to visit places in between calls for service, and we call that directive patrol in our city. And so that's a measure of being in the area, being seen, being present. So not only if we can intervene against someone who may be bent on replicating the crime, then they'll see us and perhaps we'll have an influence through our presence. That also serves the purpose of helping people feel safe in their community, appreciative of our presence. That's a demonstration of the trust they have for us. And I believe firmly that apprehending people and charging people will have an effect on that. When individuals see that persons are not being held accountable, or not apprehended, and I'm probably teeing you up for this.
Right, I was going to say, Chief O'Hara.
That's on purpose, Chief.
Yeah.
It's when people notice they're not being held accountable, others aren't, then they may be bold enough to give it a try.
Right. So you're saying these guys are not looking to get caught. These people they don't want to get caught and make a statement. They'd rather not get caught. So when they see other people getting arrested and prosecuted for these crimes, you're saying that has an impact on
It's absolutely necessary because, like Deputy Chief was just saying, the threat never ends, right? Like we were just at we knew there was an arsonist running around setting masjids on fire in our city. We knew the threat was at the highest level, like immediately, but it didn't go away just because we made an arrest. There is, you can tell, just as been referenced tonight, just by reading what's on social media and some of the comments people openly make. This is where it starts. It starts with the words and the language that's okay to be used here. So yeah, I mean, that's a concern. We've been in contact with, I think, 13 of the masjids in the city, trying to help, with some security things. We're trying to create a couple of group spaces where we can have some ongoing meetings with some of the elders in the community and create more engagement around that. But this is not by any means a threat that goes away completely just because we make an arrest. But I mean, imagine how bad it would be if we weren't able to have any accountability and being able to bring some sense of justice. And it doesn't matter, as Chief was saying, it doesn't matter if someone has mental health issues. This is extremely dangerous. Right. And what we saw in Minneapolis over the last few months was just an increasing escalation of these really dangerous behaviors. Right. The person needs help, that's fine. They can get the help in federal prison.
Right.
So, yeah, absolutely, if that's all right. I think there is an important issue that needs to be addressed in terms of what justice can look like and also how to prevent, right? How to prevent some of these acts. Respectfully, I think, there are different theories of change in terms of deterrence, right? But Chief O'Hara rightly mentioned that even after people get arrested, this threat doesn't disappear, right? And so part of the big questions that we have to ask ourselves, right, as a community and as a society are, well, how do we combat white supremacy and this ideology? It can be thinking creatively with legislators about policy around social media and white supremacist language. But I do think it does matter whether somebody has mental health issues, right? And I think it's important to not just say, well, this is a crazy person, and excuse me for the ableist language, but I think it does matter, because what if somehow that mental illness exacerbates, right, the ideas about hate? Or, for example, there was an earlier account that Andy Luger mentioned about a person who was houseless here, right? What if that person, they're in extreme dire straits, right? If that person had housing, or if a person had mental health services to begin with, they might not be acting on some of these things about hate. They might even be able to address some of this source of hate. So I think it very much matters that we talk about that if we really want to address kind of ahead of time the issue of, well, where does this hate come from? Why do people act on these things? And do people need the services that they need so they don't attack our Muslim siblings?
Thank you. I think we set some really important context for the recent attacks that happened and have happened over the years. But it's something I'm hearing a lot is just the idea of being proactive versus reactive. And so I really hope we can get some insight into ways these attacks can be prevented at different levels. So Imam Yusuf, can you kind of just give us a sense as to, how much does it actually cost mosques to prevent attacks, whether that be through installing security cameras or hiring a security guard? What does that cost burden look like for a mosque?
And I think physical security of a mosque, depending on an average mosque, will not be less than about $200,000 a year. And having said that, that does not mean, if the structure is secured, windows, doors, cameras, good cameras, all of that, that will not stop the attacks. It may reduce, the damage, or maybe deter some people from, causing more damage or things like that. That will not stop the real cause of what's going on. But cost-wise, I think it's about that range as far as I know, depending, the size of the mosque, the number of people who attend, and also how many windows, doors, and all of that mosque has. So it varies, but it's about that average.
And I know you kind of mentioned earlier that it's not affordable, right, for a lot of mosques, especially in the Twin Cities, to install security cameras or hire a full-time security guard. Can you kind of, you said 200,000 on average, but that could look differently for different mosques across the state. So can you kind of give me some insight into the affordability of that and just how important it really is to afford that?
No, definitely. First of all, I think the need is felt now more than ever. And just as Chief O'Hara mentioned, the intentionality to support 13 mosques, and that intentionality is coming because the financial restraints that these mosques have, just in terms of just getting basic equipment. And we also understand that Mayor Carter has made a commitment to, purchase or provide some cameras for some of the houses of worship, specifically in St. Paul. So we have 13 mosques in Minneapolis. We have 8 mosques in St. Paul potentially that will, get support. That's 21. But what about the other 69 that we have across the state of Minnesota? So we still have a huge gap in terms of how do we financially at least equip these mosques with just the basic fundamentals of having a camera that isn't, only activated based on motion. Specifically, even in this mosque, we were able to put things together because we were able to identify a shadow, right? And that shadow was just, enough to tip off, to get to at least apprehend the perpetrator, right? But other mosques across the state, they don't have just that basic, fundamental need of just having adequate infrastructure. And I think we have seen some members of our community step up, but we also need the legislature to step up. We need Governor Walz to step up. We need both, leaders of the House and the Senate to step up. We know that there's been some funding that's being spewed about, specifically $300 million that could potentially go to nonprofits, specifically, depending on the language, that could come to mosques. But the language isn't specifically clear in terms of what that money can be used. Like, can that money actually be used for cameras and security infrastructure? So we do need a stronger intentionality that is followed up by action to actually provide these places of worship, basic fundamental security infrastructure. And secondly, I think that with the point that Professor made a little bit earlier, with just the way that hate crimes are happening, we do need a way for police departments across the state to prioritize these calls that are coming from places of worship, right? There might be this commandeering issue that a lot of people might be alluding to, but specifically if you look at this mosque, there were kids downstairs, and that is leaving a detrimental impact because there was an event that we went to in one of the mosques in St. Paul that got burned, and there were kids saying that, hey, I don't want to go back to the mosque, I'm scared, right? But all of those things could have been prevented if there was, a proper security infrastructure that's in place to at least, monitor who's going to be able to come into the mosque. And right now we're purely relying on prayer and sheer luck to make sure that one of these mosques isn't fully burned down to the ground. So I think we have the need, we have seen the need over and over and over again, but we really need the legislature to step up, the governor to step up, and actually allocate some of the funding to go specifically to houses of worship.
I do want to talk a little bit more about what policies are potentially out there to kind of shift the burden a bit. But I really want to emphasize the point that mosques are usually fundraising themselves to pay for these things, and they're already spread thin. And you mentioned that you were able to find, in this case, it was just, you saw a shadow, right? Like, it's really just bootstrapping your resources to really figure out what went wrong and how to protect congregation. But can you tell me a little bit about the landscape of resources that are available to mosques? Who's responsible for providing those resources, and what's the accessibility gap been like to even access them in the first place?
No, that's a great question. So looking at it, so there is a national security grant that nonprofits can apply for, and us at CAIR Minnesota, we've been helping mosques apply for these grants, but a few and far in between have come back with any. So you're allocating resources to help mosques apply for these grants. And the grants are already highly competitive, right? And the state has demonstrated a need. So I think, again, we need to, it's not enough for all of us to continue to highlight these issues. We need other stakeholders that are part of the conversation to come to the table and actually advocate for the state of Minnesota at a national level so that we can funnel some of these dollars back to the state to make sure that we can ensure just the basic safety of Minnesotans. And specifically when it comes to other funding opportunities, we actually worked with one of the foundations here to, and we received a small grant to be able to hire somebody to go out and not only aggregate resources that exist across greater Minnesota and the metro area, but to also bridge some of the gaps so that there can be other police departments outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul that can come in and help with security assessments and figuring out what other resources exist that we can pull through. But again, everybody's feeling underwhelmed. We're under-resourced and we are under attack.
Professor Zaragoza, can you talk a little bit about what kinds of policies and laws are out there to prevent hate crimes from occurring, and are there any past examples of strategies we can look that mosque leadership can look to for guidance in their efforts?
Sure. So in terms of a policy update that exists from the most recent public safety kind of omnibus bill, is that the Minnesota Department of Human Rights now has additional funding to collect data on hate crimes and other acts of bias. And so it's not simply defined by crimes, right? Not simply limited to those things that are actually, to folks who are brought in and charged, but other acts of bias that can be racial or based on religion or any number of different protected statuses, which is a great complement to the systems that we already have because rightly, as the Imam mentioned earlier, right, there is a history of, after 9/11, even here, the U.S. Attorney surveilling or looking at the Muslim community, right? So there is some trust issues and other reasons, by reason of language or other reasons that people might not necessarily feel comfortable, reporting a crime or going to the police. And so there are alternatives, right? People can go to CAIR, and now through this new appropriation, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights will collect that data by other means, right? And so there's another way to kind of keep track of that. But so I raise that because that's just a new policy, but there can be other alternatives too, right? In order for people to be able to report, let's say that they see, if we talk about not from within the Muslim community, but let's say people out there who are concerned that their family members might be engaging in white supremacist kind of ideologies or rhetoric, or they're on certain forums or on social media, they might feel concerned, right, if their family member has mental health issues, if they just don't want their family member to be charged because it's their loved one. They're, having alternatives where people can still say, hey, I'm concerned for this person, building these different ways to both support their family member, but at the same time potentially stop something horrific from happening. Investing in those kinds of things is another additional helpful thing. I also think that these practical issues of making sure that the masjids have security cameras, but also functioning fire alarms and smoke detectors and doors and kind of the basic infrastructure, right? Making sure that you have working batteries. And so, in those smoke detectors and so on and so forth. So all of those little practical issues, yes, it's an issue of funding, but also, unfortunately, you all are accustomed to, you can't necessarily wait until you do get the funding to prepare, right? Because you never know when the next incident is going to happen. So on that note, in terms of a practical, non-policy kinds of solution, there's this idea from kind of the political ideology of transformative justice called pod mapping. So without getting into too abstract of an idea, basically what it is building a network of people who you can call to in an emergency. And so ordinarily, that's the thing that is so difficult about these attacks on houses of worship. This is the community that you rely on for your safety, right? But so a lot of times people can take for granted, I will rely on this community broadly, like this amorphous community in an emergency. So, but actually taking the time to specifically map out who is the person who we could call if there is a fire? Who is the person who maybe after the fact, is there a contractor who knows how to remove burned carpet and replace it? Having these practical skills so that you know, now unfortunately, there isn't necessarily a delay, right? You obviously can't always plan for it. It might happen in, you know, during hours when people aren't here. But really, emergency planning in a really thoughtful way, unless and until you do get the funding that you need.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And all was said was really amazing, and it's all adding up to two areas. One is the short-term solutions of how to get protection for the mosques, and that has been covered. And this is where it comes, you know, the funding, the security, and issues, and even as basic as fire drilling and training for active shooter or things like that. The police and community can provide and work together on that. For every mosque, have a plan for that. These are short terms, and they're all really great. And mosques cannot afford, masjids cannot afford doing all of that. It's basic trainings they cannot afford because they're trying to maintain the center, collecting funds almost every Friday or weekend to sustain the mosque. And this is not a community that's wealthy or rich. It's a poor community that is struggling in life in general, you know, and they have their worship centers they need still to support. So the mother who's working and her kids goes to the masjid, and she also works at the Walmart, she still pays her dues or sadaqah or charity at the mosque. So that's how they're trying to survive masjids. So that needs to be looked into that way of, you know, how we can get a quick, you know, help for the mosques. Anything is helpful. Even the smallest training is helpful. So that is that. The other one is that the professor was talking about, and I really appreciate it, is going back to the roots of this. And I think in the United States, we need a cultural change to what is how Muslims are looking at. That's where things start from. Today, there was a cultural change. Yes, there's a racism still existing, discrimination is still existing, hate and whatever phobia existing. But there are things people can come out with. Nobody can come out with N-word or being anti-Semitic out in the open, or run for a seat, running on that platform. But you can have in many places of the country where a man or a woman or a person can be as vocal as against the Muslims and still, you know, collect funds, even get more support, or even get and more votes for that. So what we need is cultural change, and that cultural change has to be in line with, or, you know, in coordination, a cooperation of the whole society, starting with the media and our universities, research centers, you know, and talk shows. There are very hateful talk shows towards Muslims in the country, out in the open. So that is where we start from. Then policies follow. Policies of criminalizing, you know, such words. Is criminalizing Islamophobia nationwide in the state of Minnesota. And, you know, and passing laws, you know, giving special protections. You know, we have special protection for the species, endangered species, right? I consider these mosques nowadays endangered species because, you know, it's easy to attack. There's no security for it. People, you know, are instigated easily and they can do whatever they want. So that is my worry is for this to continue, build up. Another politician comes of another level, uses the same language, or even worse, gets more votes and gets more money, and then it comes back to the community. So I think we should go to the roots for this.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I think we have time for one last question before we get to audience questions. But I wanted to ask Chief O'Hara and Deputy Chief Lego, after hearing some of the comments here about, you know, long-term needs, what steps are the Minneapolis Police Department and St. Paul Police Department taking to, you know, participate in that long-term change that's just as important as the immediate needs of communities?
Well, I do think it's about engagement sustained over time. I do think it's important for us, again, it's important for me to be present in community, but also, locally with the local precinct inspectors, the officers who work geographically in these neighborhoods, and to have these relationships before something happens. Imam mentioned before, we're preparing active shooter training to provide for the masjids in Minneapolis, because that's a need that's been identified by community. We're organizing some sort of roundtable discussions to be had with some of the elders in community to keep that going on an ongoing basis. But I think it's incredibly important that we continue to have these conversations, that we continue to have a presence, because these masjids are more than just the houses of worship. They're centers of community. There's community events. I think it's important for us as police officers, the local police officers, to be present when there are community events, to have relationships with the local precinct inspectors so that we know and that we're able to provide assistance and help when an imam or someone in the community knows that there is a problem that we may need to be able to respond to.
No, I agree 100% with what the chief said. What we can do proactively is generate and sustain relationships at the local level. For us, our precincts we refer to as districts, and we have district chiefs, commanders, and sergeants, and having those relationships at the lowest level possible to push that authority down and to really enjoy the assertiveness that our officers have to engage individually. Like Minneapolis, we have many officers that practice the Muslim faith, and they are leading officers who do not practice that faith and perhaps another into those spaces, and we're being welcomed in those spaces, and that's tremendously important for the sense of well-being, and also to demonstrate the opposite of otherness for the people that we serve, the togetherness that we have, and identification that we're more alike than different. That generates a greater sense of purpose and service in your police officers.
Thank you for this portion of our panel, and please stay on stage because we have some questions, and if anyone else has questions that I've got some here that somebody wrote down, but I think we've also asked folks you can text questions as well. So I think what we'll just do is I'll start by there's several questions on here. A couple directed towards members of law enforcement and others. And I want to start with one that asks to everyone, is there space to go beyond the punitive model and develop restorative, community-led safety tactics to protect our Muslim siblings? What would be the minimum? This is going to make it hard to read somebody's writing here. Well, let's start there. Let's talk about other models to basically that focuses on restorative justice and healing. What would you like to see along those models? Obviously, as we've talked about, arresting people and putting them in jail, there's still more who come. Just some ideas. I'll start with the Imam.
Yes, and thank you so much. That's a very important question. Yes, and there could be a community, more outreach from the mosques to the neighbors, and vice versa as well. Neighbors reaching out to the mosques, and as far as I know, mosques have, especially at times of Ramadan, we have a community iftar. And I believe the chief has attended many iftaris this Ramadan, last Ramadan, actually, and we both attended many together. So that's one of the ways to community peace building and neighborhood, watch. I remember when the time of George Floyd murder in this city, and Philip's neighbors of Abu Bakr, this area, they boarded the mosque, the windows of the mosque, because there was a lot of destruction going on Lake Street. And they were really amazing people. I mean, they all came together, and there was a community watch group that was, taking turns in guarding the area. So I think things like that, more reach out to Addis, and having more community events and, neighborhood events, I think that would help more the community so that they can at least, as they say, if you see something, say something. At least that could help.
Thank you. Deputy Chief Legault.
I'll just make a comment that security is everybody's concern in this area. It is too much for the mosques to defend themselves, and our police officers truly cannot be in every place and every moment. In the circumstances we've investigated, we benefited not only from security measures taken by the mosques themselves and the masjids, but also by eyewitness statements and video from neighboring businesses and homes that helped us to put those cases together. And in order to support that is the outreach. There's not a more welcoming community in our city than our Muslim houses of worship. And I'm grateful for that. And people have taken advantage of that opportunity to get to know and to be more alike than different. I took that and took it to a tactical perspective for security, but that outreach and shared commitment to neighborhood and community is terribly important and has to be supported, and certainly will be supported by your police departments.
Mr. Ibrahim.
Yeah, I think so. The idea of deterrence, right, and prevention, I think it's we're in the heart of that conversation, I think, here in specifically in the metro. But specifically, I think our religion, I believe in Islam, is a religion of mercy. And mercy is at the core of everything that we do. And I want to, mention the specific incident that happened in Moorhead with a young man that was apprehended. During the sentencing hearing, the judge allowed for some room for the community members to come in and provide commentary. And the mosque came to the hearing and decided to forgive the young man and invited him to come into the mosque. Right, as a part of, as a part of his sentence, to come and actually become a volunteer of the mosque. And that had a tremendous impact on the young man, right? And I say that within the same breath of understanding that what is happening to the mosques are unfortunately not only traumatizing our children, but might be leaving a legacy of our kids, worshiping by looking over their shoulder, or they're at a Friday prayer, and every single time somebody comes into the space, everybody's looking at the door instead of listening to the lecture, right? So I think those two things can coexist, but I think it's something for the community to ponder about. But I do think that there is room for restorative justice.
Yeah.
Chief O'Hara.
I agree with the comments being made, but I need people who are not here to understand what we're talking about. I need people to understand what happened here. There was a fire upstairs here in this building where there's a daycare while our people were praying. It was an escalating situation where we already had arsons, another house of worship damage, and all other sorts of hate from the same person. Thank God there's a firehouse across the street, and the fire trucks were actually at the firehouse. If that firehouse wasn't there, or that engine wasn't available at that time, we could be in a totally different situation right now. I need people to understand that, because this was terrifying for the people who pay my salary.
Right.
I listened to the stories even before this and then afterwards. I mean, you wouldn't believe the questions I'm sure you were getting, some of the imams. People were absolutely terrified to go about their regular course of days because they recognized how serious this was. So yes, of course I believe in restorative justice. Of course I believe in addressing the underlying issues. But when we have something that's this serious, this is something that has to be dealt with through the justice system, regardless of whatever underlying issues there are, just to keep people safe and to show our community, our victims, especially our victims who feel like they're discriminated against, they're marginalized, they're victims of hate. Yes, we take this absolutely as seriously as it gets.
Professor Zaragoza.
Yes, thank you. So thinking about restorative justice, absolutely. I think it's essential. And I do want to take a moment just to talk about the idea, which is actually rooted in an alternative to prosecution. And there was actually some funding allocated in the latest public safety bill for some kind of alternative and diversion types of programs. And there's somebody who works with the Minneapolis and NAACP named Dr. Raj Sitaraju, shout out to him, who has led some restorative justice, has been able to divert from prosecutions, for example, in an instance where there was an indigenous man who had defiled a Christopher Columbus statue, statue for reasons that, I understand because of indigenous genocide. But I raise this as an example because it was an opportunity for him to talk with the people who felt some affinity to Christopher Columbus and to come together and to talk to each other. And so the example that was mentioned earlier too in Moorhead, right, that as part of the sentence, so still within the criminal legal system, but the members of the masjid invited this person over and that it made a difference, right? So sometimes there's a question of whether, and that's something that we do need to grapple with as a society, right? Whether there can be an alternative in some instances, instead of prosecution or lengthier prison sentences, of having this community conversation, of having that moment of restorative care with a person and of that mercy, right? And thinking about this, right, when it comes specifically to racial terror that's also related to Islamophobia, I think of, right, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, right, and the power of that, or that we haven't had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission here. But we can have small moments of that in a variety of different contexts, and including when there are acts of hate and violence against the Muslim community here.
Right. I think we got time for one more, and this question also touches on some of the discussion we've had earlier about the link between hate speech and hate action. And the questioner wants to know is from a law enforcement perspective, what that line is that somebody crosses from making a statement, perhaps a joke or some type of, they may think it's a joke. Where do police officers, where law enforcement draw the line between somebody making a statement that's offensive and something that's a threat? Yeah. Chief O'Hara.
So, I mean, for all the blessings that we do have, under our Constitution, one of the things that's often uncomfortable is, we do have to protect everyone's freedom of speech, whether we agree with it or not. Where the line gets drawn is defined in statute. So unfortunately, a lot of the hateful things, a lot of the craziness that we see on social media that is absolutely disgusting is legal, right? Because people are able to have free speech under the Constitution. Where the line gets drawn is where people make threats, where people are inciting violence, inciting people to take action against other people. That's where the line is drawn, and it's specific to state statute. And in these types of cases, oftentimes, we know what we're looking at when we see, a type of vandalism or an act of graffiti. We know what we're looking at. But we need, as we mentioned earlier, we need to ensure that we're providing evidence for all the material elements of the offense, to ensure that we're able to present a prosecution for a hate crime, which is what we absolutely want to do every chance that we get.
Right. And Deputy Chief Legault, I mean, just so people are clear, freedom of speech does not cover somebody writing something on somebody else's, like on a mosque, spray painting hateful words on a mosque, correct?
That's correct. Something that I heard Chief O'Hara saying, I agree with 100%, is really it requires a furtherance. Now, it doesn't have to be a physical furtherance, but the damage by spraying hateful words on a wall is a physical furtherance of the hate speech, a manifestation of that with the hands. If a person feels threatened and they call the police department, we will certainly respond and investigate. And if we can generate the evidence that demonstrates the actor the person speaking the hateful words is causing, is in a person's space, is pursuing them, is abusing them in such a way that it's near to the physical touching or a furtherance physically of the action. That's the kind of thing that, that's what I think you're referring to as far as the evidence required to satisfy the elements of the crime.
Right.
The words spoken are no longer benign when there's a furtherance of action towards another person or onto a person or property.
Right. I want to give the Imam the last word. I know that's a concern that you've expressed, and just your thoughts on, again, that line that you see. I don't know if you've personally been on the other side of that line, if somebody addressing comments to you, but your thoughts on how we make that distinction between what is somebody just saying something hurtful and then something that is a direct threat to Muslims.
Thank you so much. I'm not a legal expert in this. The chiefs talk about, and the debate talk about that. And probably this is more towards, whether this thing is illegal or illegal. And what they're saying, that's, it's up to the court of law and the constitution of the country. And yes, there is a freedom of speech, but at what level? And is it, how about if it harms others? How about if it, replicates and gives people, the incentive to harm others? So I don't think every word is legal, and I don't believe freedom of speech does not have limits. It does have limits. If somebody is out in the open anti-Semite, and he will be canceled, or she will be canceled. Likewise, if somebody is against, skin color of a particular type, and that person will be canceled. Sometimes it might not be even illegal or illegal. It's about the culture of the society, the culture of the country, the understanding of the community. And that is where things come up. And unless, we move from that culture of accepting or, tolerating the Muslims culturally. I'm not talking about legally now. Mm-hmm. And in literature was even the Muslims to be, calling names, and use it as scapegoats, campaign tokens, name it, all of those. That is what worries me than what somebody writes on a wall or whether they have freedom of speech or not. It is the cultural issue that has been building for years that needs to be changed gradually.
Right. Well, thank you all very much. We're at a time here, and I want to respect everyone's time. And thank you again so much, everyone, for being a part of this discussion. Of course, I want to thank the Masjid and the Mercy Islamic Center for letting us be here tonight. Sahan Journal, MPR News, Hiba Ansari, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, and everybody have a great night.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Nice to meet you. Yusuf.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for hosting. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Professor. Nice to meet you.
I am.
Which school?
Oh,